Are we ready? To our audience of 7. Hope you find this interesting and applicable to your lives and research. Our titillating title is Theories of Meaning and Teaching English as a Second Language and the Influence on the Philosophy of Language, on TESOL pedagogy. Okay, so Lisa and I we both got our master's degree from here in teaching English as a second language, and we both teach at the Intensive English Institute currently. We're both ESL teachers to adults in higher education. That influenced our decision to come here and get our PhDs. It influences our research and the things that we think about. And recently we just took a course together from Pradeep Dhillon on theories of meaning and the philosophy of language, the class that everyone thought looked great, but there were 7 of us in there, I think. So we combined these two things. So basically what we have to say today, these are our questions. As English becomes increasingly widespread and changes in the process, how should and how will the philosophy of language impact TESOL? How have pedagogic developments in the TESOL field reflected in parallel developments in the philosophy of language? And how will new developments in English as an international language with a presence that's unprecedented in world history intersect with the philosophy of language as it is today? So what we're doing is talking about intellectual trends that have happened since the beginning of TESOL, and we're going to talk about the intellectual trends right now in the philosophy of language and where language teaching in general, including English as a second language, might be headed in light of the things that are going on right now in philosophy. So this is kind of what you're going to hear us talking about. We're going to go back and forth in history, kind of starting with TESOL and bringing in what are the intellectual trends, I guess is the phrase that we're using, that are going on that have influenced language teaching.
So a discussion of the history of TESOL, teaching English as a second language, and second language education and English language education usually starts with classical grammar translation method. It goes back to the 17th, 18th, 19th centuries where people were studying Greek and Latin, and translation was done word by word, and rarely did people actually hear well, you couldn't hear Latin being spoken, and the emphasis was on reading and writing, and you would typically never even hear how a language actually sounded. So classes were usually conducted in the student's native language, and attention was to learning vocabulary and grammar rules, often by rote and drilling. This approach, even though it's outdated, is often used in many classes to this day. But with increased travel and tourism in the 1850s, 1870s, a new rising demand for language instruction developed. And that was when Charles Berlitz came on the scene. We still have the Berlitz schools and what he called the direct method. And this was an immersion method of study. And it meant an inductive feel for grammar rather than learning grammar by the rules. Students were expected to pick up the language, and it was mostly for conversational purposes and mostly for speaking. A focus on grammar returned in the early 20th century and went until around the World War II period. It's called the audiolingual method. It may be what you remember yourself from school. It followed with the rise of the gramophone, and it was now it was memory and rote teaching. And
a lot of those old black and white movies where people have headphones and there's a teacher standing in the front and there's a lot of listening and repeating.
It went with technology and with language labs also. And they call it the audiolingual method. It became what was called the Army method in World War II when they realized that they needed more educated language practitioners in the field.
I mean, that is not uncommon to see in the Defense Language Institute still today.
These were Skinner and Pavlovian techniques, and they had to do with habit formation, repetition, outside stimuli, and drilling. And this success really favored somebody with a good memory. So that was the TESOL period. Now, in the same time, the philosophy of language was developing, especially with Saussure. Sorry, I lost my place here. So these early methods and approaches focused on discrete vocabulary learning and grammar sentence formation, and they were in line with philosophy of language and linguistics at this time. We begin our discussion of this with the Swiss linguist Saussure from 1857 to 1913. Grammar analysis as we know it would not exist without Saussure. Before him, linguistics was primarily treated in a historic and a descriptive manner, but Saussure looked at language development synchronically, not over time, but at a particular moment. And it was Saussure who recognized structures. He was the first, so to speak, structuralist. And his recognition of the sign and the signifier and the arbitrary assignment of words to things. It was his philosophical contribution, which made the structures of language more clear. The arbitrariness of assigning a word to a thing made the focus to the underlying structures and the commonalities that language have. So it doesn't matter what particular word is used to identify something, the systematic purpose and function of the aspects of language became clear. Another one of his notable contributions is the distinction between what's called parole and langue. And langue is like the theory of language, parole is about talk. And he was mostly concerned with the theory of language, the abstract theoretical field that is greater than any one language, the language system. Whereas talk is the concrete use of language, the act of speaking, and that would be left to others to really develop. When Noam Chomsky emerged as a prominent linguist in the 1950s, he also considered language as a system. However, where Saussure looked at the word, Chomsky looked at the sentence and the generation of language within grammar structures. Chomsky's combination of linguistics with biology and psychology led to the development of the field of language acquisition, and from there to second language education, which is the field of TESOL as well. His theory of universal grammar, which highlights the innate human capacity for acquiring and generating language and its patterns, was highly influential in second language acquisition field. That brings us to where Natalie will now take over.
Yeah, so structuralism influenced globalization in that it influenced language teaching as well and how we learned languages, and it still does. Usually when you're talking about the field of TESOL or language learning, people stop at Chomsky. They think, okay, universal grammar, structuralism, dividing things. That's kind of where the discussion stops, so we want to take the discussion a little further. Those who know more about the philosophy of language will have heard about Wittgenstein, Austin, and Searle, and they introduced the concept of speech acts. Well, Wittgenstein talked about using language instead of just classifying language, which was big. And then Austin and Searle introduced the concept of speech acts, which again is further using language, and it focuses on communication. So can you communicate with the language that you're learning, not just can you write it and read it? And it's, even though that was a long time ago, I mean, Wittgenstein died in 51, Austin in 1960, Searle, he's still alive, but yes, he's quite old, 80s, I think. This concept of speech acts. So let me give you an example of speech acts, okay? A speech act is for asking for permission to do something. That would be considered a speech act. It's different in it's different in English than it is in Spanish. There are different cultural norms, or asking for giving an apology, saying I'm sorry. That's a speech act. It's different in Chinese than it is in English. For example, in Chinese, you rarely say I'm sorry in the way that we say I'm sorry in English. We use those terms, those acts are different things. You say different things, you approach them differently. So that was big in revolutionizing language teaching in TESOL. So I'm curious to know how a lot of you learn English and what the methodologies and approaches that your teachers and instructors use. So this might help a little bit. This began the introduction of communicative competency in language teaching. Some of you might have heard of that. Two influential people were Canali and Swain. In 1980, they introduced 4 language competencies: linguistic competence, which was grammar, vocabulary, pronunciation. That's just one of the 4 language competencies. The others are sociolinguistic, discourse competence, and strategic competence. So this revolutionized what we did in the language classroom, especially in English language classrooms. Then I'll just quickly go through a few other things. So structuralism was kind of there, and people started talking about language and use. The communicative language approach came into play. People still use that now. That's still kind of one of the popular things that people say, oh, I teach with a communicative approach, which means they just want you to talk in class, talk out of class. But that's actually kind of old in TESOL language approaches. The newer things are task-based language teaching, where you learn how to actually do things, and then the teacher pulls out what you need to learn from there. So that's kind of where we are right. There was also another approach, the natural approach with Chason and Terrell, which was modeled on the theory that people learned languages as children. Child language learning and adult language learning were the same, which they're not. So people don't use that anymore. But that brings us to now. We have, a couple of minutes left. I think we can skip over Derrida. Then there was Derrida and all of that. Well, let's just skip over to that. And then let's go to multiculturalism, okay? I'll quickly, multiliteracies approach. Cope and Calancis here in the College of Education are very influential in the theory of multiliteracies, which we think is the intellectual trend right now when it comes to language learning. And there are two things that we want to highlight very quickly. One is the importance, so multiliteracies is the expansion of what it means to be literate. It's not just reading and writing anymore. It's literate in videos. It's literate in processing images. There's different kinds of literacies, and we should be teaching children in their theory. This is a theory for first language literacy, teaching children different types of literacies, and technology and things like that. Then the other part is difference. We should be embracing lots of different diverse language abilities, and so there's no one wrong or right English, okay? So we are going to propose how this will affect TESOL now and in the future.
So the idea that there are different Englishes in the world has a home here. This is where the School of World Englishes was developed with Braj Khashru. In the 1990s, there were a number of publications that were very significant. Linguistic Imperialism, Cultural Politics of English, English as a Discourse of Colonialism, Kanagaraja, who's very influential now on translingualism. And these, all of these approaches were singling out English and its role as a post-colonial power player, and is it correct to be emphasizing a standard English? And this went all the way through pedagogical critique in the period. It has also to do with domestic politics and whether or not standardized English is appropriate to be teaching, what the standards are. So. In the field of world English, this is an alive question, and
it's a really controversial topic. Are we going to continue teaching what is standard English today?
And how is TESOL going to deal with that? Because these are questions of, with English now playing this particular role within the world as the international language. What happens when the
majority of English speakers are now not
native speakers,
quote, native English speaking,
and the role of English is changing because there are so many people using it who aren't native speakers, and they're using it among each other, and they're using it in different ways than it's used in the native English speaking center countries. So all of these things are issues that are going to be quite alive when it comes to teaching English.
Right, and the difficulty with multiliteracies, they touch on this and they talk about it and move it to an adult second language learning realm, but the multiliteracies approach is for first language learning as a child. And for example, one of their major platforms that they stand on in this approach is that we should throw out grammar teaching, really, because children learn grammar. You don't have to teach. Why do you need to know what a verb, an adjective, and why do you need to know hanging prepositions? It's not important. But when you learn language as an adult and your second language, those categories categorizations are quite useful, and our experience as students want to know them, and research says it's important for adults to learn that. So there are some complications with multiliteracies and TESOL, but the main thing we see is the world Englishes and difference in language. So
those are just some of the issues that are on the table in this field.
Questions?
Thank you so much. That was great. I'm wondering if you've thought about looking at registers or context of language use in the whole multiliteracies literature. Is that something that's familiar?
Yeah, context and registers in the multiliteracies approach.
Yeah, I mean-
Yeah, well, actually, TESOL's been dealing with that for a long time. When we skipped over Derrida, Derrida introduced the concept of discourse and things like that. So since that time, in communicative language teaching and task-based language teaching, that's already dealt with, and that's changed language teaching and what it means to know a language already. So that is already a part of TESOL.
Okay.
Yeah, so it's not a controversial issue to stand on with multiliteracies. Yeah, it's a good question. Thank you for your question.
How does the changing characteristic of like students now that they become more digital natives in a sense affect the teaching or the philosophy of teaching English to users that is now characterized by a lot of technological loads?
There's a lot of use of technology that runs through the TESOL field, and also in the multiliteracies, at the core of the multiliteracies approach is that students should both learn from technology and learn to use technology, and you see that reflected in the TESOL field as well. So there's all kinds of computer-based methods.
There's a subfield of TESOL called CALL, Computer Assisted Language Learning. They have their own conferences. It's a big subfield that you can study under.
There's a lot that you can access online and lots of ways to use technology. And there's the feeling that technology could solve all our problems, and there'll be computerized translators that will be really usable in the future. And we won't even need to learn another language. We'll all be translating among ourselves.
And about 5 years ago, a big thing was virtual worlds, and we'll all be able to learn any language in the world virtually through something called Second Life, which you may or may not have heard of, which shows that that was not necessarily the wave of the future. But there's a lot of people thinking about that.
A lot of experimenting going on with technology and language.
Oh, thank you.
It's okay. Moore has the microphone.
Thank you. Well, I don't know if this might be relevant to your topic or not, but it's about international students coming to North American universities and being tested for their proficiency. And those of us who have taken either the GRE or the TOEFL test really have to deal with two separate worlds. The linguistic context you were instructed in English in your country with a lot of influences from local languages, and the reality of testing based on either British or American English. How does that speak?
Right, so that's what we're talking about with the multiliteracies approach. It's an intellectual trend that's going on right now, talking about language difference and how we should embrace language difference in a democratic approach. But when it comes to policies in ESL, especially in higher education in the US, we're not there yet. And Nicole can talk about that. Actually, it's a hot topic right now at U of I. So that's exactly what's going on right now in TESOL. And how is that going to be reflected in not only in teaching, but in testing? Yeah, and grading and conferences and writing and all those things. Yeah.
I just have a really quick question. I'm wondering if you even know about this. So we're getting a lot of kind of push right now about, kind of the neuroscience of learning. And I'm wondering if that has any influence on the role of TESOL, or if it's because it's so, language-based, that it's more along those lines.
So, since Chomsky, there's been a division in the study of language. Second language acquisition opened up, psycholinguistics came along, and now there's neuroscience and how language is acquired in the brain. There is a very large disconnect between second language acquisition, neuroscience, things that they do in Beckman, and what they do in the foreign languages building. The two fields, although they're directly related, do not communicate to each other very well at all. At TESOL, practitioners don't study second language acquisition. They don't write second language acquisition research in a way that is communicable to practitioners. So the two fields don't talk. Another thing is, I think a long time it was decided, maybe in the 80s or so, it was decided that that's fine to know, like in your brain, if you're going to acquire the use of articles before you acquire the use of past tense verbs or whatever, but it doesn't really matter that much in teaching approaches and methodology. So they're interesting things to study, but they don't matter that much necessarily.
They don't affect teaching pedagogy at this point,
Not that
especially.
much, yeah.
Yeah, good question.
I don't know if we have a question.
I don't know if I need this, but I wasn't here while you were talking.
Go anyway.
Go ahead. Go ahead.
And I hate to jump in, just like, you know.
Jump in, jump right
I
in.
just want to know if you've already talked about this. I was talking to the other Natalie, Lloyd, actually just a few days ago, and it was about language learning, second language acquisition, and we were talking about a mutual horrible experience we had in a class at this school that will go unnamed, but you can probably, if you do a little digging, you'll find out. But this is the thing. One question I would like to know is, do you make a distinction between language acquisition and learning? So like when I say acquisition, I'd be talking about like what young children do but before the age of like, 6 or something like that, where they just kind of absorb a language or multiple languages. And like what I would do as an adult, which is have to study really hard, learn grammar, things like this. Did you make a distinction between this?
Yeah, these are really big theories, and of course there's no proof that one way or another. But one of the things that that Chomsky opened up was the idea that there was a learning acquisition device in your brain, and that there was a window for which you were like especially open to language learning. Now they say that it may not be so much that it's so different for adults and for children, that children learn slowly over a long period of time with a lot of love and a lot of attention, and that if adults were taught that way, they may also learn as children had learned. Also, adults have now a competing language in their brain. They have learning techniques that they've developed. So it's hard to tease out exactly what's going on. And you have different schools of thought on it. People line up on different sides of that topic. But at the moment, I think from what I understand, it's not so black and white which one's correct and which one's not.
Right, but there is a distinction, and it's widely accepted that adults and children do learn language differently, which is why there's a problem when we're talking about theories of language that don't deal with adult second language acquisition. These are all theories of language that are just about language in general, your first language, learning as a child, or what have you, which is what Chomsky originally thought about. So you can apply them to adult language learning, so second language acquisition, even though it may be your third or fourth or fifth language or whatever. It's called second. So there may be applicable things in there, but, I think it bears mentioning, though, like, no one really knows very much about language learning, but people have been learning languages, we learn language. They've learned language with methods that we consider terrible and would never use today, with the headphones and the audiolingual and the grammar translation. We learn language.
And people have different individual capacities for picking up language, clearly. Yeah. And but it's a position of the TESOL field that it is meaningful for adults to learn grammar and to learn language structures. Not at this point, it's pretty discredited to think that you can just be immersed in the language. That was what they call the natural method,
Quite
and crash in.
discredited.
Cool,
Quite
thank God for
discredited.
that.
And crash in, and that you would just pick it up inductively
Although, I
if
mean,
you weren't
might,
taught
you
it.
may or may not be interested to know there's a new method, not an approach, but a method to language learning called the growing participatory approach, which is exactly trying to emulate a child learning environment for an adult. It's, in my opinion, terrible, but guess what? People learn language using that as well. Maybe not as well, but they still learn it, you know? So it's hard to convince people, because language is something everyone does, so, but not everybody knows a lot about it. So it's hard to talk about because everyone thinks they know. You know, my grandma learned English by watching soap operas when she came from Cambodia or whatever. I hear that story every day, and it's like, well, okay, my grandma didn't learn that way, you know?